this look funny? No, this is not a, people call it, it's not a range. How's my feather? Bedraggle? Well, they're supposed to be eagle feathers, but this is the closest we could get to an eagle. Called a pigeon. No, it's really not that funny a hat. When you stop and think about it, people say, well, that's a ranger hat or a Boy Scout master's hat. Actually, this is a hat, the sort of hat that was worn by one of America's favorite storytellers. And I'll bet you cannot name him. When he was out west in the silver mines in the Nevada territory, he probably wore a hat like this because it was very popular in those days with the men out west. You couldn't name him, could you? Because you've never read any of his stories, you never heard any of his books or stories. Oh, things like Tom Sawyer, you don't know who wrote that. Or Huckleberry Finn, or you wouldn't, Roughing It. No? You know who that is? Who? Really? Good stuff. Some people. Who is it? Mark Twain. See, old Uncle Mark, when he was out west, he would wear a hat like this. And he was on the frontier. And when the frontier fellas would gather around the fire at night, chances are very good that they asked Mark Twain to tell a story. And we know for a fact that he told stories from his youth to entertain the fellas around the campfire. And you can just imagine later on when he wrote some of those stories down, how he might have told them around the campfire. He might have said, well, boys, now this is a story from my extremely youthful days when I gave the matter no thought but indulged freely in what is now called practical joking. It involved Jim Wolfe. He was an apprentice in my brother's printing shop. He was about the bashfulest grown person I've ever known. Well, old Jim and I were fast friends, and sometimes I would sleep in his room over the print shop. Sometimes he would come to my room at the house, and we would stay up long after decent people had gone to sleep, and by the light of a cold lantern tell ghost stories to one another under the blankets. Well, one day while I was at chores, I found the window in Jim's bedroom was thickly cushioned with wasps. And I had what seemed to me to be a happy inspiration. I pulled back the bedclothes on one side of the bed, and at the cost of one or two little stings, I brushed a few hundred of the wasps down upon the sheet, and then turned the covers over and made prisoners of them. And I made a deep crease down the center of the bed to keep the front side safe from invasion. And then that night I offered to sleep with Jim. Well, he was willing enough, all right. Well, see, I made it a point to be in bed first to see if it was still a safe place in which to rest. It was. None of the wasps had passed the frontier, you see. Well, Jim was chatting away as usual, some subject or other, but I couldn't answer because by anticipation I was on the point of laughter. And even though I'd gagged myself with a hat full of sheet, I was about to explode in a minute. Well, presently he said he's about ready for bed. So I blew out the light, let him climb in the dark. He stretched himself out comfortably, still chatting away, you know. But presently, his talk began to be disjointed. Separations intervened between the words, and each separation was punctuated by a more or less violent twitch of his body, and I knew that the immigrants were getting in their work there. I knew that I ought to evince some sympathy and ask what was the matter, but I could not do it, for I should laugh if I tried. Well, finally, he stopped talking altogether. That is, on the subject which he had been pursuing. He said very quietly and reverently, he says, "There's something in this bed." I knew it, of course, but I held my peace. And then he says, "There's thousands of them." And this I felt to be an exaggeration, but again held my peace. I used to have a fine instinct for discretion in those days. No matter. Well, then he said he's going to find out what it was. So he reached his hand down and began to explore. Now here is something which you did not know. Wasps, as a political party, resent this sort of intrusion into their affairs, and so they began to sting him and stab him all over and everywhere. Well, finally, he said he'd captured one of them, asked me to strike a light, and I did it. And by the light of the candle, you could see as he got out of bed that the back of his nightshirt was black with half-crushed wasps sort of dangling by one hind leg. You know how they do that. And in his two hands, he held a dozen of them prisoner, and they were stinging and stabbing him with energy, but his grip was good, so he held them fast. His grip was always pretty good. And by the light of the candle, he identified them, he says. Wasps. Why not? Not even a Presbyterian could have said it better, I thought. Well, in silence, he uncovered his side of the bed, and dozen by dozen he removed the wasps to the floor, where he beat them to a pulp with the red letter edition of the King James, with a sort of an earnest and vindictive Old Testament kind of satisfaction, I thought. I did not have occasion to think upon that incident for, 2 or 3 hours. Whereupon I was awakened with Jim sitting astraddle my chest, pummeling my face with both hands. Well, I did not say he was a stupid boy, did I? And this caused me to reflect inwardly and to resolve never again to engage in practical joking, unless I believed it was the will of God. And that's the story of Jim Wolfe and the Wasp.